Jonathan Hayes had everything a man could dream of. At least, that's what people said whenever they saw his name in the newspapers or spotted him stepping out of his shiny black car in the city. He owned businesses in different countries, traveled first class, wore suits that cost more than what most people earned in a month, and lived in a mansion so large that people often joked it could be mistaken for a hotel. From the outside, Jonathan's life looked like a perfect success story. But behind all the success, there was a side of Jonathan's life that very few people saw. His wife had passed away when their son, Daniel, was only 10 years old. The loss had broken something inside Jonathan. He threw himself deeper into work, maybe as a way to escape the silence of his home, maybe to distract himself from the pain of losing the woman he loved. He told himself that working hard and building an empire was his way of securing Daniel's future. If he made enough money, if he gave Daniel the best schools, the best toys, and the best lifestyle, then maybe his son would never feel the emptiness he secretly carried. But children don't measure love in money. Daniel didn't need more toys, or expensive gadgets, or a mansion filled with art pieces he wasn't allowed to touch. What he needed was time. What he wanted was his father. And that was the one thing Jonathan always seemed too busy to give. The mansion where they lived had long hallways, shiny marble floors, and chandeliers that sparkled like frozen stars. Yet, for Daniel, it often felt like a cold museum. He had grown used to having maids, chefs, and drivers around, but none of them ever stayed long. They came and went like passing clouds. Some were too strict, some were careless, and others simply didn't understand how to deal with a quiet boy who hid his feelings behind short answers. Daniel learned not to get attached. Whenever he started trusting someone in the house, within months they were gone, replaced by someone new. Jonathan, meanwhile, was rarely home long enough to notice. He believed as long as his son had everything he asked for, there was no real problem. Birthdays were celebrated with grand parties Jonathan often missed. School events were attended by drivers instead of him. Even dinners were lonely because Jonathan would usually return late at night, after Daniel was already in bed. Everything began to change the day Grace arrived. Grace was unlike the previous house staff. She had come from far away, leaving behind her small hometown in search of work. Life had not been easy for her. She grew up in a family where money was always short, yet her parents had taught her values of kindness, patience, and strength. She had worked different jobs in different homes before, always with humility and care. What made her different was not just her ability to clean or cook, it was her warmth. She carried a calm energy, as though she knew how to listen even when no words were spoken. When she walked into the Hayes mansion for the first time, she felt both awe and sadness. The house was stunning, but it also felt empty. The silence in the halls was not the peaceful kind, it was the heavy silence of a place that missed laughter. Grace met Daniel first. He was sitting quietly at the kitchen counter, staring at a book but not really reading. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment, his guarded eyes seemed to measure her. Grace gave him a gentle smile. "Hello," she said softly, not in the tone of a maid meeting a master, but like a neighbor greeting a child. Daniel gave a small nod and mumbled, "Hi." That first meeting lasted only seconds, but it was enough for Grace to notice what many others had overlooked. The boy was lonely. He didn't need someone to serve him food and leave, he needed someone who actually cared. Jonathan wasn't home that day. In fact, he wasn't home for the entire first week of Grace's job. She settled into her duties quietly, but she also noticed the patterns of the house. Daniel ate most of his meals alone. He spent hours in his room, or sometimes just sat in the large garden with a distant look in his eyes. The staff treated him with respect, but there was always a certain distance, as if they didn't want to cross invisible boundaries. Grace, however, didn't believe in such walls when it came to children. She knew that every child needed attention, no matter how rich their family was. One evening, Daniel came into the kitchen while Grace was preparing a simple meal for herself. Instead of leaving quickly, like he usually did when staff were around, he lingered. The smell of her cooking seemed to spark his curiosity. "What are you making?" he asked quietly. Grace looked up with a smile. "Something my mother taught me back home. Would you like to try?" He hesitated, but then nodded. She placed a small plate in front of him, and to her surprise, he tasted it with genuine interest. His eyes brightened just a little. "It's good," he said. That was the first time he spoke more than a word or two to her. From that evening on, Daniel sometimes wandered into the kitchen whenever Grace was there. At first, he just watched. Then, little by little, he started helping, passing ingredients, stirring a pot, or even laughing at small mistakes. For Grace, these moments were simple, but for Daniel, they were treasures. For the first time in a long while, he felt warmth in his home. Grace never tried to act like a replacement for his mother, but she carried the same kind of care that a mother would. She reminded him to eat on time, encouraged him to talk about school, and even told him stories from her own childhood. The stories were different from his life of luxury, sometimes about climbing mango trees, sometimes about playing barefoot in the rain, but they fascinated Daniel. They showed him a world outside money and big houses, a world full of simple joys. Meanwhile, Jonathan was far away, attending meetings and signing deals, unaware of the small changes happening in his mansion. He believed his son was being looked after, and in a practical sense, he was. But what Jonathan didn't know was that Grace was giving Daniel something far more valuable than any toy or school trip. She was giving him connection, attention, and love. The stage was quietly being set for the night when Jonathan would return home and find something that would shake him in ways he never expected. Jonathan Hayes's private jet landed at the city airport just after sunset. He had returned earlier than expected from a long business trip overseas. Normally, his arrivals were carefully scheduled, with staff preparing for days in advance. But this time, he wanted to surprise his son. It had been nearly 3 months since Jonathan last stepped foot inside his mansion. The moment he entered, he noticed the familiar grand silence. The marble floor gleamed, the chandeliers sparkled, and the tall windows stretched like eyes watching the night sky. Everything looked perfect, as always. Yet, something inside him longed for a different kind of welcome. He imagined Daniel running down the stairs, surprised and happy to see him. Perhaps they would sit together in the living room, or Jonathan could ask him about school. He thought of all the small talks he had missed. Did Daniel make new friends? Was he doing well in his studies? Did he still play piano like his mother once encouraged him to? Jonathan had no answers. He loosened his tie and walked toward the dining hall. Usually, by this hour, the staff would have laid out dinner, but strangely the table was empty. The mansion felt alive, but not in its usual, polished way. There was a faint sound coming from the kitchen, the clinking of plates, the bubbling of food being prepared, and, surprisingly, the sound of laughter. Jonathan froze for a moment. Laughter. That sound was so rare in his house that it startled him. He followed it carefully, his expensive shoes tapping softly against the floor, until he reached the kitchen doorway. The sight that met him was unlike anything he expected. Daniel was sitting at the wooden kitchen table, his sleeves rolled up, his hair slightly messy, and a smile stretched across his face. In front of him was Grace, the new maid Jonathan had barely met before leaving for his business trip. She was standing near the stove, showing Daniel how to stir a pot properly. The air was filled with the warm smell of fresh herbs and spices. Jonathan stood silently, watching. His son looked alive in a way Jonathan hadn't seen for years. Daniel's eyes sparkled as he asked questions, and his voice carried a tone of comfort and ease. Grace, with her gentle smile, answered him patiently, sometimes correcting his grip on the spoon, sometimes laughing softly when he made a small mistake. For a brief second, Jonathan felt invisible in his own home. His son hadn't noticed him at the door. A strange wave of emotions swept over him. At first, there was surprise. He had never imagined Daniel in the kitchen. His son was usually quiet, reserved, always keeping to himself. Then came confusion. Why was Daniel spending time with the maid instead of doing homework or reading? And then, without warning, came something heavier, discomfort. Jonathan had worked all his life to provide the best of everything for Daniel. Yet here was his son, smiling more in the company of a maid than he ever did around his own father. The thought stung deeply. He cleared his throat. Both Grace and Daniel turned at once. Daniel's face lit up in shock and excitement. "Dad! You're home," he exclaimed, rushing to his father. Jonathan hugged him awkwardly, patting his back, still distracted by the scene he had just witnessed. Grace lowered her eyes respectfully. "Good evening, sir," she said softly. Jonathan gave a short nod. "Evening," he replied, his voice carrying a mixture of warmth for his son and cold formality for her. Daniel, however, was too excited to notice his father's tension. "Dad, Grace was teaching me how to cook. Look, we were making her special recipe. It's really good, you should try it." Jonathan glanced at the pot on the stove. The smell was inviting, but his pride wrestled with him. He had always imagined himself as the one guiding his son, being his role model. Instead, he had returned home to find someone else filling that space. He forced a smile. "That's nice," he said. "But shouldn't you be studying instead of cooking?" The word slipped out sharper than he intended. Daniel's smile faded a little. He looked down, fiddling with his fingers. Grace noticed the sudden change but stayed quiet. Jonathan felt a pang of guilt at his son's reaction. He hadn't meant to dampen his excitement, but something inside him couldn't accept what he had seen. Why was Daniel so comfortable with Grace? Why had Jonathan never managed to create that same bond himself? Later that night, after Daniel went to his room, Jonathan sat alone in his study. The house was silent again, but this time the silence wasn't peaceful. His mind replayed the scene over and over: Daniel's laughter, Grace's patient teaching, and the warmth that filled the kitchen. It was a picture of family, and Jonathan wasn't in it. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the shelves of books he rarely read. For years, he had told himself he was doing everything for Daniel's future. But what if he had misunderstood what his son truly needed? Money could buy comfort, but it couldn't buy connection. His son was growing up with someone else's guidance while he remained a stranger in his own home. That night, Jonathan couldn't sleep. His pride whispered that it was only natural for staff to take care of things in his absence. But his heart argued that this was different. Grace wasn't just cooking for Daniel, she was giving him the attention and warmth Jonathan had failed to give. For the first time in many years, Jonathan felt like he was losing his place not as a businessman, not as a millionaire, but as a father. And that thought frightened him more than any business deal ever had. The next morning, Jonathan woke up earlier than usual. He had not slept well. The memory of last night, the sound of Daniel's laughter echoing in the kitchen, still played in his mind like a scene from a movie he couldn't turn off. It unsettled him, not because his son was happy, but because he wasn't the reason for that happiness. He walked through the quiet halls of the mansion, the sunlight spilling in through tall windows. Normally, mornings at the Hayes household were calm and orderly. The chef prepared breakfast, the staff moved silently in the background, and Daniel often ate alone before heading to school. But today felt different. As Jonathan approached the dining room, he noticed the table was not fully set. Curious, he followed the faint sound of voices coming once again from the kitchen. There they were, Daniel and Grace. Daniel was sitting at the counter, dressed in his school uniform, but instead of eating quietly as usual, he was helping Grace slice fruit for breakfast. His face was bright, full of energy, and he asked questions in a tone that carried warmth rather than formality. Grace guided him patiently, correcting his clumsy attempts with a gentle hand. Jonathan stood quietly at the doorway, unnoticed. For the second time, he found himself observing instead of participating. And as he watched, an uncomfortable truth began to take root in his mind: Daniel trusted Grace. Daniel felt safe with her. Daniel was learning from her in ways Jonathan had never taught. For a man who had built his entire life on controlling businesses, controlling outcomes, controlling his future, this was hard to accept. At breakfast, Jonathan finally joined them. Daniel greeted him happily, offering him a plate of the fruit he had cut himself. Jonathan smiled faintly, taking a bite, but his mind was far away. The fruit was sweet, but the taste of guilt was stronger. As the days passed, Jonathan found himself paying more attention to the quiet bond forming between Grace and his son. He noticed how Daniel's eyes lit up when she asked about his day at school, how he spoke openly about small successes or disappointments, things he never shared with Jonathan. He noticed how Grace never rushed him, never dismissed his thoughts. She listened. Really listened. Jonathan tried to join in at times, but he quickly realized how distant he felt. When he asked Daniel about school, his son replied politely, but without the same excitement he showed when speaking to Grace. When Jonathan suggested spending time together, Daniel often hesitated, as if unsure what they would even do. This realization was painful. One evening, Jonathan sat in his study with a glass of water in his hand. The large oak desk in front of him was covered with documents, reports, and contracts waiting for his signature. Yet, he couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting to Daniel's laughter in the kitchen. He remembered his late wife, Emily. She had been the heart of the family, the one who always brought warmth into their home. Jonathan had been the provider, the builder, the dreamer. Emily had been the listener, the caregiver, the bridge between father and son. When she died, Jonathan thought money could replace what was lost. But now he realized it couldn't. Grace's presence had reminded him of something he had long buried: the simple power of attention and kindness. She wasn't rich, she wasn't powerful, and yet she had managed to touch Daniel's heart in a way Jonathan had failed to. This thought humbled him. At first, pride made him defensive. He wanted to see Grace as just an employee, someone who should remain in her role. But each time he saw Daniel smiling beside her, that pride softened. Slowly, Jonathan's discomfort began to shift into something else: admiration, perhaps even gratitude. One night, after dinner, Jonathan walked past the kitchen and paused. Grace and Daniel were baking together. Flour dusted Daniel's uniform, and his laughter filled the air as he tried to crack an egg without making a mess. Grace chuckled, guiding his small hands. Jonathan leaned against the doorway, silent, watching them. For the first time, instead of jealousy, he felt a warmth spreading inside him. He saw not a replacement for himself, but a reminder of what he could still become. Later that evening, when Daniel went upstairs to do homework, Jonathan approached Grace. "You seem to spend a lot of time with my son," he said, his voice even but curious. Grace looked at him with calm eyes. "Yes, sir. He likes to help in the kitchen. He enjoys learning new things." Jonathan hesitated. "And he talks to you?" She nodded gently. "He does. Children need someone to listen. Sometimes they carry feelings they don't know how to express. He is a good boy, but he is lonely." The words hit Jonathan like a quiet blow. He knew it was true. For years, he had excused his absence by calling it providing for the future. But what about the present? Grace continued, choosing her words carefully. "I don't mean to overstep. But he misses your company. He may not say it, but I can see it in his eyes." Jonathan was silent. For a man used to boardroom negotiations and sharp business talk, This simple truth felt heavier than any deal he had ever signed. That night, Jonathan lay in bed wide awake. He realized the turning point was already happening, not in a single dramatic moment, but in small, quiet ways. Each laugh, each shared story, each warm meal between Grace and Daniel was reshaping the atmosphere of his home. And if Jonathan wanted to be part of it, he would need to change, not as a millionaire, but as a father. The next evening, Jonathan did something unusual. Instead of locking himself in his study after dinner, he wandered toward the kitchen. Normally, he avoided that space. He had always seen it as part of the staff's world, not his. But tonight, something pulled him there. When he reached the doorway, he found Daniel and Grace again, laughing together. This time, they were rolling out dough for bread. Daniel's hands were clumsy, flattening the dough unevenly, and Grace gently guided him. The sight was simple, almost ordinary, but to Jonathan it felt extraordinary. For a moment, he just stood there, watching. Then, gathering courage, he stepped inside. "Mind if I join you?" Jonathan asked, his voice softer than usual. Both Grace and Daniel turned to him in surprise. Daniel's eyes widened. "You want to cook with us?" Jonathan nodded awkwardly. "Well, I can try. But you'll have to teach me." Grace smiled warmly, sensing the importance of this moment. "Of course, sir. There's always room for one more pair of hands." Daniel's face lit up in a way Jonathan hadn't seen in years. He eagerly handed his father a small rolling pin. "Here, Dad. Try this one." Jonathan took it and attempted to copy their movements. At first, he pressed too hard, flattening the dough until it stuck to the table. Daniel burst out laughing, and even Jonathan found himself chuckling at his own clumsiness. The laughter filled the kitchen, breaking years of unspoken distance. It was the first step. That night marked the beginning of a new pattern. Slowly, Jonathan began to spend more evenings in the kitchen with Daniel and Grace. At first, he only joined them occasionally, but as days passed, he found himself looking forward to it. The kitchen, once a place he rarely entered, became the heart of the home. They cooked simple meals together: pasta, soup, sandwiches, but it wasn't about the food. It was about the conversations, the laughter, and the shared effort. For the first time in years, Jonathan wasn't just providing for his son with money, he was sharing time, patience, and presence. Daniel began to open up more. He told Jonathan stories about school, about friends, even about small worries he had never mentioned before. Jonathan listened carefully, sometimes unsure of what to say, but always grateful that his son was finally speaking to him. One evening, Daniel surprised his father by saying, "Dad, I like it when you're here. It feels different. Better." The words pierced Jonathan's heart, but in a good way. He realized his son wasn't asking for perfection. He wasn't asking for endless riches. He just wanted his father to be there, beside him. Jonathan also began to see Grace differently. At first, he had viewed her with suspicion, worried she was taking his place. But now, he understood she had not replaced him, she had simply filled a void when he wasn't there. Instead of feeling threatened, he began to feel thankful. She had protected Daniel's spirit from becoming too lonely, and she had reminded Jonathan of what fatherhood truly meant. One evening, Jonathan stayed behind after Daniel went upstairs. Grace was cleaning the kitchen, and Jonathan hesitated before speaking. "I owe you something," he said quietly. Grace looked up, surprised. "Sir." Jonathan cleared his throat. "You've done more for my son in these last few months than I have in years. You reminded me that he doesn't just need comfort and security. He needs me." Grace smiled gently. "Children don't measure love in money, sir. They measure it in time, in words, in small things. He is a good boy. He only wanted you to notice him." Jonathan nodded, his chest heavy with both guilt and gratitude. "Thank you, Grace, for not giving up on him." From that night onward, Jonathan tried harder. He attended Daniel's school events, even if it meant rescheduling meetings. He made time to have breakfast with him before school. Sometimes they still cooked together in the evenings, sometimes they simply sat in the living room and talked. The change wasn't sudden or dramatic, it was slow, built day by day, like a house being carefully repaired after years of neglect. But Daniel noticed. His smiles grew brighter, his laughter more frequent. He began to trust his father in ways he hadn't before. One Saturday morning, Jonathan suggested they go for a walk in the garden together. Daniel agreed eagerly. As they strolled among the flowers, Jonathan finally asked, "Do you feel happier now, son?" Daniel looked at him, eyes shining. "Yes. Because you're here." Those words stayed with Jonathan like a priceless treasure. The kitchen, once a quiet space reserved for staff, had become a symbol of healing. It was there that father and son rediscovered each other. It was there that Jonathan learned the truth: love wasn't about providing the world, it was about being present in small, ordinary moments. Grace continued to work in the house, but her role had grown beyond that of a maid. She had become a trusted friend, a guide, and someone who had helped mend a broken bond. Jonathan respected her deeply for it. In the end, the resolution wasn't about Jonathan reclaiming his place. It was about learning to share it with Grace, with memories of his wife, and most importantly, with his son. For the first time in many years, the Hayes mansion was no longer silent. It was filled with voices, laughter, and the warmth of family. And Jonathan, the millionaire who had once thought wealth was enough, discovered the greatest richness of all: love, presence, and second chances. Years later, Jonathan Hayes would often look back at that evening, the one when he returned home unexpectedly and found his son in the kitchen with Grace. At the time, it had felt like a moment of shock, even discomfort. But in truth, that night had planted the seed of change. It was the moment that led him to rediscover the meaning of family. The mansion no longer felt like a silent museum. It became a home again. The echo of footsteps in the hallways was now mixed with laughter, conversations, and the small everyday noises that made life feel real. Jonathan's study, once his place of escape, now stood open more often, with Daniel walking in freely to share stories about his school day or a new project he was working on. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Jonathan had to learn patience, something he had never truly practiced in his business world. With Daniel, he couldn't rush trust or force closeness. It had to grow slowly, like a plant cared for each day. And so, he kept showing up. He joined meals, helped with schoolwork, and even tried hobbies that Daniel enjoyed, no matter how unfamiliar they were to him. One memory that stayed with him was the first time Daniel introduced him at a school event. Jonathan had taken time off from an important meeting, something the old version of him would never have considered. As he entered the school hall, he noticed how Daniel's eyes searched the crowd nervously. Then, when Daniel spotted him, his face lit up with joy. "This is my dad," Daniel told his teacher proudly. Those simple words carried a weight Jonathan couldn't put into numbers or business terms. For once, he wasn't just Jonathan Hayes, the millionaire businessman. He was simply Dad. And it was the most important title he had ever held. Grace remained an important part of their lives. Though her official role was as the maid, everyone in the house knew she had become more than that. She was the quiet strength that had held Daniel's heart when Jonathan was too far away. She was the gentle reminder of kindness and patience that Jonathan himself needed to see. Over time, Jonathan began to treat her less like staff and more like a trusted friend of the family. On many evenings, the three of them would still gather in the kitchen. Daniel, now more confident and older, often took the lead, cooking new recipes he had learned. Jonathan would sometimes joke about his own clumsy beginnings, and they would all laugh together. The kitchen had become their special place not because of the food, but because of the memories it held. Jonathan also began to notice changes within himself. For years, he had defined success as wealth, deals, and recognition. But now, he measured success in smaller, quieter moments like hearing Daniel laugh freely, or seeing him grow into a young man with humility and kindness. Grace's influence had shaped Daniel, but it had also shaped Jonathan. He was softer now, more thoughtful, and more aware of the value of time. One afternoon, Jonathan sat in the garden, watching Daniel practice soccer with some friends. Grace joined him, carrying a tray of lemonade. They sat quietly for a while, both watching the boy run across the field with energy and joy. "He has changed so much," Jonathan said softly. Grace smiled. "Children grow quickly when they are loved." Jonathan nodded. Her words were simple, but they carried truth. Love was not complicated. It didn't require wealth or grand gestures. It required presence, patience, and the willingness to listen. As the years went by, Daniel grew into a young man with values that stood out. He wasn't proud of his father's money. He was proud of the lessons he had learned at home. He respected people regardless of their status, he carried humility in his heart, and he valued kindness above all else. Jonathan knew this was partly because of Grace, and he never stopped being grateful for the role she had played. When Daniel left for college, the house felt quieter again. But this time, the silence wasn't heavy or cold. It was the silence of a home that had already done its job, a silence filled with good memories. Jonathan walked through the halls with a sense of peace, knowing he had been present for his son when it truly mattered. Sometimes, he would sit at the kitchen table alone and smile, remembering the first night he had joined Daniel and Grace there. The memory of flour on Daniel's shirt, laughter filling the room, and his own awkward hands trying to roll dough, it was all still vivid in his mind. That night had changed everything. Looking back, Jonathan realized that wealth had once blinded him. He had thought he could protect Daniel by surrounding him with luxury. But in truth, Daniel had been starving for something far simpler: love, time, and attention. It wasn't money that had saved his son from loneliness, it was Grace's patience, and Jonathan's decision to finally open his heart. In quiet moments of reflection, Jonathan often whispered a silent thank you to Grace, to his late wife for the lessons she had left behind, and to life itself for giving him a second chance at fatherhood. He knew he had made mistakes. He knew he had lost precious years he could never get back. But he also knew that he had learned, grown, and changed. And for that, he was grateful. Jonathan Hayes, once known only as a millionaire, would be remembered by those who truly mattered, not for his wealth, but for the father he became. And it all began the night he walked into his kitchen and found his son not alone, not sad, but laughing beside a woman who carried warmth in her heart. That was the night his real fortune began.